I'm looking at the agenda right now, and the first item is said configurability.
Yeah, that's Rob and I. So
Wow,
yeah, we discussed it a bit last month, where Seagate, John from Seagate was here and was talking about having this issue where he was getting spurious errors, and sometimes there would be just enough to set off the threshold in Z of 10, errors within 15 minutes or whatever the hard-coded in the C file limits are, and we were looking at, improving the configuration of that. And Rob did a bit of a survey of what other issues around Z configurability people have had. We saw an old ticket from like 2019 about controlling the behavior of spares and a bunch of other things that are, were configurable on Solaris, but are not on Z on Linux. And based on that, what Rob and I think makes the most sense is to actually use the new VDEV properties framework as a way to provide the configuration for how you will, where Z can look up this information, because in particular, while we had thought about doing command line parameters last month, John from Seagate brought up the fact that, if they have two different pools, they might not want the same values for each pool. And then the command line option gets awfully messy as soon as you're trying to do more than one pool or something. And so using the existing VDEV properties framework does seem to make the most sense there. And it fits with the other part of that work we did. Mariusz Zaborski did the tracking down on that and found that the reason why Seagate was seeing different behavior with ZFS versus if they did, EXT or XFS or ButterFS on Linux, was that ZFS is specifically setting the fail fast option on the IOs before it sends them down to the Linux kernel. So that's specifically asking Linux kernel, never retry this, just report the error back to me and ZFS will deal with it. And in this particular case, because the errors are basically a transport error in the, getting the signal across the fabric they're using and so on, they actually do want the retries. And so we're looking at adding a VDEV property for that as well. That would say, on these disks, we'll set the mask on the fast fail to say, ignore transport errors, and let the driver retry those. But still, if there are other errors, then those still will fail immediately and go back up into ZFS, so that Z can actually still kick out drives that are failing, but won't spuriously kick out drives based on transport errors where retry actually does make sense.
So the bullet item in the doc here says 4 new properties. What are?
Yeah, so there's the number of IO errors in the amount of time, and then the number of checksum errors, and then in the amount of time. So the number of errors and in how many seconds for both IO errors and checksum errors that result in Z deciding that disk is bad and should be kicked out. And then kind of only slightly relatedly, the fifth VDEV property we would do is for controlling the mask of the fail fast bits that we send down to the Linux subsystem, so that certain errors, the driver, like the controller driver, will auto retry instead of not, because currently ZFS is explicitly telling the driver not to, and we want to be able to tune that to say, retry transport errors, but don't retry if it's the drive gave an error.
Right.
Alan, is there an inheritance facility for VDEVs, or do they inherit from like a common pool one, or would you have to set it explicitly on every drive?
We didn't do inheritance when we designed it. We talked about when it would be useful and when it wouldn't. I think in this case, we can probably do something reasonable, but where you would only have to set it on each top level VDEV instead of every VDEV. Or have it do something like if the setting isn't set either way on the VDEV, on the leaf itself, then check the top level VDEV to avoid having to set it on every disk. But we don't currently have inheritance on VDEV properties because for some of them, it didn't make sense to have it, but there are some cases where maybe it does. And so I'm definitely open to what people's thoughts are about how to deal with inheritance there. Like, I guess we do have the precedence of like, was it, I think can mount and a couple other normal properties that don't inherit.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking off the top of my head, that's like, it's in the general sense, it seems more like a pool property, like the error rate type stuff. Although
Yeah.
you could have a non-homogeneous pool, I suppose, but
yeah, we had talked about a pool property originally, but Brian was kind of against that. VDEV properties are a little more out of the way, so it's not going to clutter up the user as much, but it might actually make sense to do a pool property for these instead. But you know, whatever you guys will accept when we upstream it, I guess is it comes down to.
yeah, I mean, the pool itself doesn't have a VDEV property, right?
No,
It's just top levels.
I
mean,
think
could the
root does, I think, have a zap. The only issue is I'm not sure how you would address it with the command line interface we have now, because it uses the like is pool check to tell when you specify multiple names on the command line, it checks whether the second one is a pool or not to then decide if you're doing VDEV properties. So it might not actually be possible to access the root one, but we might be able to come up with a way around that. Like we already, made a special keyword of like all dash VDEVs, and maybe we could have, root dash VDEV or something to access the root of the pool's VDEV properties. That might make sense.
Yeah, I was thinking, or some type of, I don't know how you do it in the CLI where you could say, apply this to all.
Nice.
VDEVs,
Recursively setting it.
Yeah, some -r or something, so you don't have to.
Yeah. One of those two, I think, makes sense. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
I'm surprised it's taken this long. It's like when we had done the original Z work, we had, I think, a phase 3 that we were going to do the configuration, and it just never had an owner, I guess. So.
Yeah, we looked at that too and thought about, if we pull in like libucl or something to do config parsing, we could make a config file for it. But then starting to think about how you would lay out that config file in a way where you could specify values for different pools or whatever, it quickly became, do we just make this a pool property?
Yeah, the other one was just an artifact of how it was implemented, but so no need to model that necessarily.
Yeah. Good morning, Mr. Rob. Yeah. I think the Illumis, they have just a configuration file that they were pulling in, and they only end up setting 3 values. It'd be quite a bit of work to bring in for only having to set a few things for the thresholds. But that's just what I noticed as I was looking at some of it.
I'm kind of curious if anybody's ever changed those thresholds. I would imagine you'd want to in some scenarios, but
Yeah, I think currently you just have to recompile Z with the new static values.
no. But in the Solaris context, did people think they were too aggressive or not aggressive enough? Or
I didn't see any historical references to it. Just searching around. The ones on FreeBSD are quite a bit more lenient as far as the default manager that we're using over there. I think it's 60 errors and some odd seconds or something.
yeah,
As opposed to 10 and 10, or 10 errors in 10 minutes, or what I believe it was.
It's a 10 and 10 or 10 and 15, one of the two.
Yeah.
Don, did you want to talk about your NFS thing before we go into another of my topics?
Sure. Yeah, we discovered sort of in our use of NFS that you the exports file, there's a file that has all the ZFS specific exports for NFS. It can sometimes have orphaned entries in it, and on Linux that prevents the server from starting up. It tries to stat everything, and if it can't, it just falls over. So I was looking at ways to prevent that. The first approach would be just to have us reset that file whenever we do a ZFS share-a. And in our case, that actually, solves the problem, because before the Linux server, NFS server starts, it'll actually call the share service to do that. But then in talking with Alan about FreeBSD and sort of how it's architected, it kind of makes more sense to push it down into ZFS proper rather than on top of it. And I've started on that. The other issue is that destroy itself, at least on Linux, I don't know about FreeBSD, it looks at, instead of looking at all the data sets to see if you have this property, share NFS property, it scopes it to just what procfs knows about what's mounted. And so if your file system is not mounted or unmounted behind ZFS's back, like using umount, then like when you do a destroy or when you're tearing down, it doesn't know, it's just looking at procfs. So if you don't have a mount, you'll leak, you'll orphan that entry. So Alan, I was thinking as the next phase is we have our exports file, and there's one on FreeBSD is in addition to looking at what's mounted in the system, looking what's exported on the system, expand the scope a little bit. So if that makes sense. So that should solve at least the one I was seeing with, if it's not mounted, we can orphan the reference.
Yeah, because I think the other idea I had for that was, we have this mounted read-only property that tells us if the data set is mounted or not, and we could have one for shared. So then, at destroy time, we could just, as we're walking the list of data sets and dealing with them to unmount them and everything, we could make sure to unshare them as the pool, before the pool goes away.
Okay, yeah, I thought the issue was that we didn't want to iterate over all data sets, so we just iterated over all mount points.
Right.
So I was going to just expand that to iterate over all mount points and all exports, which should contain.
Yep.
At least for this particular problem.
Yeah, I had to look at how that works on FreeBSD. Mav, do you know how we deal with walking the list to decide what to unmount and so on when you export or destroy?
No, I don't remember. I haven't touched that side.
Yeah, it's a bit less of an issue on FreeBSD because mountd will just complain about each line that doesn't work, but still reload and still start properly. Unlike on Linux, where NFS will just not start if there's any bad lines in the exports file. So it's not the end of the world, but I don't know if we have an easy way to get a list of all of the exported file systems in order to walk that and unshare them.
Well, the way it's architected, it looks like each OS has an exports file and has a lock for it. That's at least that's how it. And so I'm presuming there's an exports file generated on FreeBSD.
Yes, there's like etc ZFS exports
Yeah,
on FreeBSD.
and then it has a concept of like what's mounted on the OS. So I don't know what its sources on FreeBSD, but on Linux it uses procfs. So
Right, and we can get the list of mounts. I just don't know if we can easily get the list of what's exported with NFS, other than the exports file.
The file is hard coded inside of,
Okay.
you know, yeah. So just in that file, we'd have to parse that file.
Okay.
Because the trick would be like, what's the format of that file? I don't know. But to the extent we can parse that file, then we can generate a list of additional things to check.
Yep.
So I think, yeah, with those two changes, the first change is to truncate the file before we rebuild it, and then the latter one would be to source it when we're tearing down. I think that it's all, at least the issues we know about.
Does share NFS play nicely with any exports that someone may have configured prior to using ZFS share NFS?
So in FreeBSD, any ones you manually configure will be in etc exports, and then the ZFS ones will be in etc ZFS exports, and mountd just reads both. I'm less sure what would happen if you had the same one in both, but the etc ZFS one has a big statement at the top about how it's owned by ZFS and you shouldn't modify it. But the problem Don ran into was if you manually unmount the data set with umount rather than like ZFS umount, and then destroy the pool, ZFS didn't notice that it needed to remove that data set from the exports file. And so if you restarted the machine with that pool now destroyed, it would mention, hey, go share this data set via NFS, but it doesn't exist anymore. On FreeBSD, that'll just generate a warning, but on Linux, it will actually stop NFSD from starting.
Yeah, I definitely saw that get stale on FreeBSD. It was not a super sophisticated tool early on, but what's the behavior on, say, Linux? Is it sharing the same exports file?
No, Linux uses a .d convention. So there's /etc exports.d / and then there's a ZFS.exports. And so what ZFS does is it maintains that list. Like if you add a share or remove one, and then it tells NFS to be an export FS. Hey, we changed that list. It's sort of like, you know, systemd where you say like, hey, go rebuild everything because I changed one of my files. So it gets consumed that way. But if it has a stale entry in there, it'll try to stat everything in that's being exported. And if it can't stat it, it'll just fall over.
Thank you.
Yeah, whereas on FreeBSD, the rc.d script for mountd checks if ZFS isn't enabled, and if it is, it also, in addition to pulling in etc exports, it also pulls in etc ZFS exports and parses them both. But like I said, the big difference there is when it stats one of them and it doesn't exist, it just emits a warning and skips it rather than breaking NFSD.
Okay, so I'll do a follow-up on that pull request, and instead of doing it in the share service, I'll do it in ZFS proper, which unfortunately is like, you know, dozens of files because the way that it's architected, you know, I'll have to touch a bunch of files, but
yeah,
it's all minor.
I think the other idea we have was when they do the manual unmount that we should trigger the unshare then, the same as if they did ZFS umount on it. Would that also solve the problem?
I think the umount goes directly to the kernel, so then the ZFS
Right, but then
would
the
have
kernel
to
doesn't,
generate.
you get a VOP call still to ZFS, right?
Yeah, I mean
yeah.
we unmount him. I believe. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go back and check if VFS involves CFS or not. But yeah, you'd have to tickle. All that code is in userland. I think that it's, you know, share NFS. So you'd have to tickle somebody to go do something.
Yeah, and that's not fun.
No. So
yeah.
Never
mind that then.
But I mean, I think for Linux we're covered because anytime you restart the server, you also start the share service.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think probably for both, it does no harm to do what we mentioned there, where as part of the startup script, we can truncate the exports file up before we run ZFS share-a, and that way we know that we've just generated a clean one with all the exports in it.
I'm trying to think that there might be a problem in that if you add a new share and you have an orphan one in there, would that prevent the new share from being shared?
Right,
'Cause
like,
it can't process the
reloads
file.
it,
Like,
yeah.
we add a new entry to the file, but the file has an orphan entry. Does that prevent the new share from happening? And so that might be a problem.
Or does it do even worse and cause NFS to stop? Hopefully it's smart enough that when it gets a reload, it just rejects the new config file and keeps running on the old config rather than dying. But
No, yeah, that has no bearing on the service itself. It's a problem because NFS, the server uses that. It runs exportfs to regenerate it, and if that call fails, then it falls over. But
Yep.
but if you just call that independently, it doesn't affect the server. But
right, I was just thinking of like what happens when you share the new file system and it tries to tell NFS to reload. Does it?
yeah, it won't hurt. It won't hurt the server.
It won't
For the
cause NFS
server,
to
I don't think.
decide to be
But
unhappy.
it could prevent future shares, right?
Yeah,
If
all
you
those
have a-
shares, all the new ones won't work until the old one goes away. And so yeah, that's why
I'll
I think
follow up on that and see if that's a bug, and that might be. I might just file an issue and deal with that on another day. But
well, I think if we're dealing with most of it in ZFS as you described a minute ago, then we should be able to kill most of those cases. And then, the truncate thing is just an extra safety belt so that on a reboot, we definitely know we're not going to not
you're
start
right.
NFS.
What we do is we actually copy the file. So when you add a new entry, we actually create a new file, add the entry, and then copy over the old entries. So as we copy them, we could see like we can call the orphans.
Yep.
So I could fix it
That
that
could
way.
work, yep.
Okay. All right. I'll follow up on that part as well.
Makes sense. The next item we had was we have an interesting case having to do with fail mode. So we looked into it a bit, and currently the options are, fail mode equals wait, which will cause any attempts to write to a suspended pool to just wait until the pool is not suspended anymore. Continue, which is kind of a hybrid. Anything that was already somewhat in progress will continue to wait, but anything new that starts after the pool is suspended will actually just return an error. And some reads might succeed if they're in the arc or if the remaining disk can handle it or whatever. And then we have panic, which isn't very fun. But the use case we've run into is some applications that would rather get the error and be able to return that to the original request, or cause their load balancer to send the request somewhere else or something like that. So if you do an asynchronous write and then fsync it, if the pool's suspended, that fsync will just not return until you repair whatever's wrong with your pool and get it unsuspended, and that leads to that just sitting there forever and can take down what the web service or whatever is making the request to the pools. And so we wondered about adding fail mode equals error or fail mode equals fail or something like that, where when the pool is suspended, we will actually go and return an error for all of those like pending fsyncs and so on. Some of the code for this exists in the old pull request for forced export, where we go and unwind all the pending IOs and having an option like that. And then, if we finish forced export, that also raises the question of, would it be valuable to have fail mode equals export, where, if this pool gets suspended and gets to the point where it's stuck, go force export it for me so that it doesn't cause issues with my other pools. If it's hung on the SPA namespace lock or something where it's going to cause every other ZFS command to hang waiting for that lock, it's going to mean that this one pool going down is going to mean all the other pools on my system no longer work. Mav, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, I missed. What was the question?
So we're
Distracted.
looking at adding a new fail mode where currently if the pool gets suspended and you had done an asynchronous write and call fsync, the fsync will just wait forever until the pool is unsuspended and it can actually complete the transaction you're waiting for. Whereas we were looking at adding an option so that if the pool is suspended, any currently pending operations that are stuck would actually return an error and unfreeze the applications.
Well, I clearly see how that's useful. I'm just thinking how many applications actually do anything useful for fsync errors.
Yeah. This particular customer's application definitely does something useful. It can it's like an API request, so it can return to the caller that the put failed, and then the caller will just try it again, and it'll get routed to a different machine or something, and it's okay.
Well, I think it would be good to look on the fsync specification to see whether it actually expected to return error to be handled, and if so, I don't see it to be bad to have it as an option.
Yeah,
at least.
Because I remember there was a whole kerfuffle about this with Postgres, where I think it was on Linux when the fsync returned an error, the data didn't stay dirty like it was supposed to, and so a second call to fsync wouldn't ever ensure that, or would succeed even though it hadn't flushed the data that was supposed to be still pending. Whereas on like a Lumos and FreeBSD, that wasn't an issue because the data stayed dirty, so a second fsync would wait for it to be flushed as well. But yeah, I think you're right that would make sure that it follows the contract of what fsync is supposed to do as per the spec. And then the second one I was just musing about, if we get that far, was if we finish the forced export feature, do we have fail mode equals export? So if a pool encounters an error that would result in it being suspended, it gets force exported so that it doesn't interfere with any other pools that are running on the system. Because when a pool gets suspended while you were trying to do ZFS list or something, and it's holding the SPA namespace lock and then doing an operation that it gets stuck on, then every other ZFS command will not succeed until the suspended pool comes back to life or gets force exported.
Oh yes, that's annoying when one pool affects all others. We're trying to avoid the situation as much as we can with redundancy, obviously, but
yeah, and the fail mode equals error or fail or whatever might mitigate some of that as well, just because we will actually return an error. Although there's a lot of code in ZFS, like I think transaction wait for sync or whatever, that are void, and so they don't really have a way to signal back to the caller that you waited for this transaction to complete, but it failed, but there's no return value. Although I think some of that was addressed in the forced export pull request.
Yeah, I think in some situations ZFS just doesn't expect error, it doesn't accept error. Some, I think, iterations through some NV lists or some things like that.
Yeah. But yeah, we found quite a few when Will Andrews did the forced export work. And we made a bunch of those more important internal bits of ZFS actually be able to return an error instead of just being void. But yeah, we'll have to look over that.
And one suspended pool out of two typically requires a reboot, correct?
Well, it depends.
Unless you can successfully unsuspend it.
Yes, if you can get the disks back or whatever and do a zpool clear, then maybe you're okay. But otherwise, yeah, without forced export, you're basically stuck having to reboot. And so if you have 3 or 4 pools and one of them goes on walkabout, then you can have your system not be very useful.
Yep.
And especially when it's the least important of the 4 pools that happens on, it makes you really upset.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I just had another thing I was going to mention and I forget what it is now.
I'll fill some time and mention that the deadline for abstracts for talks in OpenZFS are 2 weeks from yesterday.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have anything they wanted to bring up today?
I was trying to remember what my other item was. I should have written it down.
I'll mention that the corruption healing patch finally was merged. So thanks to everybody that helped with that.
Yes, thank you for persisting on that and getting that through, because that'll be really handy, I think.
Yeah, hopefully it ends up being used and expanded on. Looking forward to see where the community will take it. But yeah, at least we have it now after a couple of years of it languishing.
That's another question I had was about some of the metadata blocks and or indirect blocks. I think in a bunch of cases, the maximum size of like an indirect block is set at 128K. But I've not blamed it, but I assume that's just from before large blocks were a thing. And in particular, I'm wondering about if increasing or having an option to increase that size. Obviously, that's probably an on-disk format change, just because it changes a define. But especially things like microzaps, if we allowed a microzap to be bigger, that might improve the performance of directories with moderate numbers of files, so like more than 2,000 but less than 10,000 or something like that. Because we see a very large increase in latency when writing to a directory when it migrates from being a microzap to a fatzap.
I don't remember how block size of zaps are controlled, but you started speaking about indirect blocks, and we on our benchmarks we found that default indirect blocks of even 128 kilobyte create huge overhead if we do random block rewrite. That's why on TrueNAS we defaulted to lower to I think 32 kilobyte now, but I think 64 may be better intermediate, but like 32 works pretty good in many cases, if not most. Because
that's
like,
just because you're writing the total amplification of changing one block and the amount of metadata you have to rewrite.
Oh yeah, you're rewriting one, for example, 32 kilobyte blocks, and then rewrite 6 layers of 128 kilobyte indirects after it. And no, that also creates disk amplification, but also decompression, recompression for those blocks, indirect blocks from ARC into DMU cache. There's a lot of CPU overhead. So just reduction of the block size saved a lot of benchmark, at least on a lot of CPU, at least on synthetic benchmarks. Yeah, well, it's like it should hurt some disk scan or sequential operation, but hopefully prefetcher should handle most cases there. So it shouldn't be too bad to have reasonably smaller blocks. But as I thought, maybe 64 could be better default than 128. I never proposed to upstream that, but we may consider that. Well, at least I definitely don't think it should be increased. I don't think it works unless somebody has some absolutely huge block sizes and definitely only sequential operation, but still doesn't make sense.
Well, I think in this particular case, it's NVMe over Fabric, and the throughput is so high and the latency is so low that writing one bigger block might actually be faster than having more levels of indirection. One thing we were considering was, should the indirect block size follow the record size? And so if you have 32K blocks, should each of your indirects also be 32K? for the same reason, to avoid that amplification. But it would also mean that if you use larger blocks, you could have larger indirect blocks. But I don't know if we always would want those two coupled together.
No, yeah, I also not sure about that. And as told, significant part of overhead we saw was compression decompression from ARC to DMU, no, obviously disk traffic too. But if disk traffic doesn't bother you, then CPU overhead may actually. And if you have huge holes in a file, then each access to them will recreate the tree and destroys, recreate and destroy. It actually maybe a separate problem that could be optimized somehow. Because right now, I think as soon as we commit transaction and we see that block is all zeros, because there is no indirect block is all zeros, it will just evict that block. And on next access, it try again to recreate it and evict again. And that's probably more like synthetic benchmark case. I'm not sure how much it happens in real life.
Well, I imagine with a large Z-vol, you'd have lots of sparse bits in it that you could end up having to happen on.
But it's mostly like case if you are randomly writing zeros over the large file.
Right.
So how many 5 people are writing random zeros to be completely compressed into nothing? But on synthetic tests, yeah, it's quite spectacular. Well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe with smaller blocks it could have sense to have smaller indirects. But on the other side, okay, if you can get main blocks of 16 megs or even 1 meg, do you really want to have so big indirects? What's the point? Your first level indirect will cover gigabyte. Like, is it really required to be that big or bigger than that? It will be gigabyte with default 128. Do you really want more than that? Like
yeah,
8
because
times
it means
more.
if you modify it, then you're writing a lot more. But do the fewer layers of indirection provide any benefit? And we'll have to test that out. But it's mostly the zaps that we're looking at, just pure files in a directory. But we, had wondered about some of these limits, and like what you were saying, it might make sense to have some way to control that.
No, for indirect, there is a CCTL on FreeBSD probably module parameter on Linux, something IBS. There are probably even several of those parameters for different block types. Yeah, on Trunas we set it through the CCTL tunable on boot.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's read on a tunable or CCTL, but I do see that. Yeah. Okay. So we'll look at that a bit and report back what we find.
No, yeah, if you find that 64K is better, I'll use 2 hands for decreasing it, actually.
Okay. Makes sense.
Speaking about other blocks, for some time I was thinking to increase a maximum log block from 128K to slightly more, like 4 kilobyte more, so that we could fit full 128 block into one log record. I don't know whether it worth increasing fuser, but at least that one specific case could be beneficial for some workloads, since 128 is quite popular block size and EO size, and splitting it into chunks probably not good. And it's like splitting one EO into parts makes them non-atomic, also not great.
Yep.
Actually, our log doesn't have concept of atomicity, so it may stop replaying at any time, but at least we could try to be a bit better.
Yeah, that does sound like that would be useful. All right, so just quickly, the last one I had was looking at the performance of copy file range on FreeBSD, and I saw, thanks Matt for taking a look at that. Does Linux do something like pathconf or something to return the granularity of sparseness in a file? In particular, right now, FreeBSD just always returns like SPA min block size or whatever, 512 bytes. And I think Alan Summers' suggestion was fixing that to actually return the record size of the specific vnode that was being queried. But I just wondered what happened on the Linux side for things like that, where you're doing, seek data and seek hole, and having a way to know what alignment those holes might have. I guess nobody else knows either. Did anyone else have anything before we run out of time?
Seems like that's it.
Okay, well, thanks everyone.
Have a good one.
And yeah, next meeting will be in 4 weeks back at the regular time, not the early time.